So, welcome back. This is Have a Good Time. Thanks for being back. I want to talk about two different things today. Two of them. First one, I'll talk about first because I feel the least naturally comfortable with it. So, I scheduled myself to get the GED, which is cool. Not having completed my high school education is something that I've felt some varying degrees of, depending on my life circumstances, varying degrees of shame and embarrassment over the last handful of years. And at a time where I was really going full hog, full steam on my music stuff, that it was something that was further in the back of my mind that I didn't have to sort of confront regularly, and it didn't really have an effect on what I was trying to do. At this point in my life, I'm like looking for full-time work. Trying to find something with more than slightly more than minimum wage, and so anyway, this is one of the paths to be able to do that. So that is something that I'm excited about, and also it's going to be to some degree, I think, maybe kind of a relief to have that kind of under my belt just for my own personal satisfaction, and it will aid me, I believe, in my search for work. So that's the first thing. I wonder if anybody else has had similar feelings surrounding the I guess you would say non-accomplishment of what's traditionally considered like part of like the path to success, or I don't know how to frame that in a kind of broader sense, because I'm sure there are other things besides just high school education or equivalent certification that would fall into that similar category. But so I'm curious to hear other people's sort of experience with that, where it's like you're told kind of by your community or culture that like this is the way to go. And it's interesting. So I always think about this. There was a Dustin Kensrue song where he says, "The media provides us with the plastic protocol. Maybe music television really is the devil after all." And it was kind of in this separate context than what I'm talking about, but I always kind of refer to that in my mind when I go back to something where it's like I hear something that I was told that I disagreed with and pushed back against when I was younger, and then I arrive at a similar conclusion when I'm a little bit older. It's interesting how that goes. You kind of maybe some of the wisdom of your elders, a lot of it is I think you could put into two different kinds of categories. One, the that which they tell themselves, which then they convey to you, which sort of justifies maybe some of their mistakes or something that they regret that they can't face, and so they have to build sort of like a construct around it to sort of justify it or live with it, so that it's not creating a constant tension within themselves. And so that's one category. And then in the other category, I would say that there's actually lived experience which they can convey to you. So I think it's incumbent upon us as we go into adulthood and different stages, different stages of our lives, going from sort of minimum wage part-time work to full-time work, or becoming parents, homeowners, stuff like that, to be able to individuate within ourselves which of those that we're sort of passing on to people who are younger than us, and because that was one of a confusing thing I would say about my upbringing, is that And this was an important realization for me to make a couple of months ago, maybe half a year ago or something, was that a lot of the values that were conveyed to me by my, in the sort of culture that I grew up with, a lot of the values that were conveyed to me verbally, sort of like explicitly, the logos, if you will, resonated with me on an instinctive level. Like I understood that things like work hard, be honest, don't hit people to get what you want. Instead, make an appeal to them, stuff like that. Stuff that was explicitly conveyed as values. Was I intuited that it was correct, but the confusion or the distortion was that I wasn't sure, because of like the people who were conveying this information to me, I wasn't sure if they believed it themselves or not. So it sort of created this distortion. So I think this is why oftentimes people will have a reaction against sort of values in general, because if values are being conveyed to you by people who don't adhere to them or don't believe them themselves, then it does create this sort of distortion. So as a result, a lot of people kind of have this backlash that any conveyed wisdom rests on an uncertain or unpredictable foundation. Therefore, values themselves have no value, which is why I think this is where this contradiction in argument arises, which is that because to say that values have no value is, of course, a self-defeating or self-contradictory argument. So I think it's important for us as we, people, I guess I would say my peers, people who are maybe 5 years younger and older than me, kind of in that category, as we're going into, sort of different, and have been going into different stages of life, to be able to individuate or to be able to distinguish between that which is, real experience that we've had and that which we're conveying, which is kind of I would say an ex post facto justification for our own actions and behaviors, or the defense of other people's actions and behaviors that we don't want to confront directly. So that's an important distinction. So, the second thing I'll talk about real quickly is Stefan Yazvek responded to the most recent video I did, which was a listener response, and he was saying that there's this difference between he's basically had the struggle to which was more meaningful. Maybe I'll just pull it up real quick because I'm having a hard time articulating exactly remembering exactly what he said. But so oh, for heaven's sakes. So Stefan said, one of the most dangerous places a person can arrive at is one where you believe that your narrative is reality. For a long time, I turned a blind eye to the disconnect between my Christian worldview and perceived reality because the stakes were so high. And that's true for everybody. I'm sure that if you were raised with any values whatsoever, there has been some inconsistencies. I think it's maybe to some degree, I think to some degree it's inescapable. So the stakes are so high, right? When I finally decided to let it go, I saw the abyss all around me, not knowing what I would find if I went out into space. It's true, it's the fear of the unknown. It's essentially represents death to us, stepping away from away from a narrative if you don't know what you're walking into, or if you don't have a support system around you. I think is another important aspect of this, that's gonna say welcome here as you're walking out of there. It's usually if you find yourself terrified of stepping outside of a narrative and either entertaining or stepping into a new one, that's probably because you don't have like a support structure around you that's going to encourage trying on different hats, so to speak. Which is tragic. It was Stefan says it was absolutely terrifying, but at some point the pull to confront reality became more compelling than the angst it took to continue with the blinders on. Good point. I've experienced the same thing myself, where, it's a process. It's a process like that. It goes from terror, no way, no possible way that could ever happen, no way I could step out of my paradigm into who knows what, to I talked about it as if I was going around. There are two different worlds, like two different planets, and I'm sort of orbiting. I'm in an orbit of both of them, And at some point, the closer I get to one of them, the harder it gets to break out of that orbit. So it's like, do you steer yourself a little bit closer so that you're going to be in an orbit of another world, And he says it was a truly painful experience, but it was so liberating, and the alternative is much worse. So that is a sort of a personal stake, and it's hard to convey to people who haven't done that. It's so hard to convey to people that's true, because it's what my friend Evan talks about. He says it's irreducibly complex. So in order for someone to understand that action of stepping out of your existing paradigm into what may be what Stefan describes as the abyss is a very real possibility. And to actually do it is the only way that you can kind of understand what it is. You can sort of, the only way to kind of convey that idea is to have specific, to make abstractions about it, right? And use sort of symbols and ideas and things like that. Not to actually walk through each one of those steps is incredibly difficult, but you do realize that on the other side of it is something better, something more real, so to speak, something more solid, firm footing. So anyway, if you're walking that line and you don't know what you want to do, I would encourage you by just saying that those of us who have taken those steps and walked out of our existing paradigms have also experienced that same terror and anxiety that you're experiencing, and we're dealing with the consequences of that, and we're generally the change is more positive. The change is more like the place that we've landed in, that we're sort of the world that we're walking in now is if you have to leave the old one behind to find the new one, then I would say it's worth it, or at least it has been for me. And it's really hard, especially if you're doing it alone, which I think most people who end up with that choice are probably doing it alone. And I would say, hey, come into our sphere. The water's fine. Thanks. This has been Have a Good Time. I'm John Davey.